a sterile millionaire disguised as a beggar, and entered the orphanage to find someone to leave his inheritance. The next day, he was shocked to hear a child call him father. The sprawling estate sat in eerie silence, its grand halls devoid of the laughter and warmth that could have made it a home. Vincent Morrow, a self-made millionaire, lounged in a velvet armchair near the fireplace, swirling a glass of wine he couldn't bring himself to taste. Wealth beyond imagination surrounded him: paintings from renowned artists, antique furniture, a closet full of tailored suits, but the one thing he craved most in the world eluded him: an heir. Vincent was sterile, a fact he had discovered 2 decades ago after countless medical tests and treatments. He had long since accepted the truth, or so he told himself, but the pangs of grief still hit him in quiet moments like this. As if sterility weren't enough of a cruel joke, fate had dealt him another blow: a terminal illness. The doctors had given him months, perhaps a year. The countdown had begun. He leaned back, closing his eyes. Images of his younger self flashed before him: ambitious, driven, conquering the world of business with a ferocity unmatched by his peers. Yet, in chasing wealth, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. He had no partner, no children, no family to hold his hand as the sands of time slipped away. His wealth had become a prison, the gilded walls mocking him. Who would inherit it? His distant relatives, who only remembered him on holidays. A soulless charity that would squander it on administration? The thought made his stomach turn. A heaviness pressed against his chest as he acknowledged a truth he had avoided for too long. He needed someone to carry his legacy. Not just anyone, a person with a kind heart, a soul that resonated with the values he wished he had lived by. But where would he find such a person? Time was slipping away, and so was hope. The idea came to Vincent one sleepless night as he stared at the empty ceiling above his bed. What if, instead of waiting for an heir to miraculously appear, he went searching for one? But not in the world of luxury and privilege. No, those people were often hollow, just as he had been. He needed someone untouched by greed, someone whose character shone in the darkest corners of life. The thought both invigorated and terrified him. Vincent, the man who hadn't set foot in a grocery store in decades, would have to leave his cloistered existence. He would have to blend in with the invisible masses he had spent years ignoring: the poor, the overlooked, the abandoned. A beggar. It was absurd, of course. What did he know of hardship? How could he possibly pass as one of them? But the more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that it was the only way. To truly see people for who they were, he had to strip away his wealth and identity. The next day, Vincent called for his personal stylist. "I need you to make me look poor," he said, startling the woman who had spent years tailoring perfection. She laughed nervously, but his stern expression silenced her. A week later, dressed in tattered clothes with dirt rubbed into his face and hands, Vincent barely recognized himself. Gone was the polished millionaire. In his place stood a frail, weary man who might easily be mistaken for someone at the bottom rung of society. As he stood before the mirror, a strange mix of fear and resolve filled him. What if he was discovered? What if he failed to find anyone worthy? But the stakes were too high to let fear hold him back. His wealth couldn't save him, but maybe it could save someone else. That evening, under the cover of twilight, Vincent left his estate and stepped into a world he had only ever observed from a distance. The cold wind bit at Vincent's cheeks as he shuffled toward the iron gates of a St. Althea orphanage. It stood like a crumbling fortress, its once pristine walls streaked with grime and its garden overrun with weeds. A dozen or so children played in the yard, their laughter sharp yet fleeting, as if they had learned to savor happiness in small doses. Behind them, a group of weary caregivers stood under the shadow of the building, their eyes hollow from years of thankless work. Vincent adjusted the thin scarf around his neck, a small gesture to steady his nerves. The tattered coat he wore hung awkwardly on his frame, and the shoes, worn thin by design, pinched his feet. He felt every bit the imposter, yet as he looked at the faces of those around him, beggars warming themselves by a makeshift fire and mothers clutching their children, he realized he was invisible. No one spared him a second glance. For the first time in decades, Vincent felt ordinary. He approached the orphanage gates and was greeted by a young volunteer, her face bright with a practiced smile. "Welcome," she said, her voice kind but rushed. "Are you here to seek shelter or to help?" "Just passing through," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. She nodded and waved him in without further questions, her attention already shifting to the next arrival. Inside, the air was thick with the smells of age and overcrowding, dust, damp wood, and faint traces of soup. Children darted past him, their clothes patched but their spirits undeterred. His heart clenched as he watched a little girl share her bread roll with a younger boy, breaking it in half with an easy generosity that humbled him. As he stood amidst the chaos, Vincent knew this place held something special. Somewhere in this sea of innocence and resilience was the soul he was searching for. Vincent kept to the edges of the room, his hunched posture and wary eyes mimicking the behavior of those used to being overlooked. The children darted about, their laughter and chatter weaving a chaotic melody that filled the space. Every so often, his gaze lingered on a child who seemed different, one who shared a toy, who offered comfort to another, or who seemed quietly resilient in the face of the hardships surrounding them. The walls of the orphanage were decorated with fading paint and crooked frames, each holding a photograph of smiling children who had once passed through its doors. It struck Vincent as both hopeful and tragic, a reminder of how many had come before and how many were still here, waiting for a family that might never arrive. As the hours passed, Vincent noticed a young boy with dark, curly hair and a pair of worn shoes that barely held together. The boy couldn't have been older than 9, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that spoke of someone who had seen more than his years should allow. He moved with quiet determination, helping the smaller children with their chores and offering gentle encouragement when one struggled to carry a heavy bucket of water. The boy's name, Vincent overheard, was Samuel. He watched as Samuel sat by a younger girl during lunch, breaking his already meager portion of bread to share with her. "You eat first," Samuel said, his voice kind but firm. The girl hesitated, then nodded, devouring the bread while Samuel smiled, pretending he wasn't hungry. Vincent's chest tightened. How could a child with so little still give so freely? There was something about Samuel, his quiet strength, his selflessness, that stirred something deep within Vincent. For the first time since arriving, Vincent felt a flicker of hope. As the days turned into a week, Vincent found himself more involved in the orphanage than he'd intended. Though he tried to stay on the sidelines, the warmth and simplicity of the children's world began to draw him in. It wasn't just Samuel who intrigued him, though the boy occupied his thoughts more often than not. It was all of them. They laughed with abandon, cried without shame, and faced each day with a resilience that astonished him. Yet, the more he immersed himself, the more Vincent's fear gnawed at him. What if someone uncovered his true identity? The world outside this fragile bubble of innocence would not understand why a millionaire was masquerading as a beggar. He imagined the tabloids turning his last days into a scandal. Even worse, what if his wealth tainted the purity of this place? The mere thought made his stomach churn. Still, he couldn't help but feel drawn to Samuel. The boy seemed to have a knack for finding those in need, whether it was a tearful child who had lost their only toy or a struggling caregiver trying to soothe a sick toddler. One afternoon, Vincent watched Samuel from a corner of the room as the boy knelt beside a boy much smaller than himself, whose knee had been scraped raw from a fall. "Let me help," Samuel said softly, tearing a strip from his own shirt to use as a makeshift bandage. The younger boy whimpered, but Samuel's calm demeanor seemed to reassure him. Vincent saw something in that moment: courage, empathy, and a quiet dignity that went beyond Samuel's years. That night, Vincent sat alone in the small corner he had claimed as his own, staring at the dim moonlight streaming through a cracked window. Against his better judgment, he felt a connection growing, a bond he hadn't anticipated but could no longer deny. It was late in the evening, and the children had started to settle into their thin mattresses scattered across the shared dormitory. The soft hum of whispered conversations and the occasional giggle filled the air, a lullaby of youthful camaraderie. Vincent sat in the corner, his tattered coat pulled tightly around him, observing the room with a growing sense of belonging. Samuel approached him, holding a small, battered book. "Do you like stories?" he asked, his voice hesitant but curious. Vincent blinked, surprised by the question. "I suppose I do," he replied, his voice softer than usual. Samuel grinned and plopped down beside him, flipping through the worn pages. "This one's my favorite," he said, pointing to a tale about a brave knight who protects a village from danger. "He's like a real dad, you know? Always there when people need him." The word dad lingered in the air, and Vincent felt a pang in his chest. "What about you, Samuel?" he asked carefully. "Do you remember your dad?" Samuel hesitated, then shrugged. "Mama said he was important, but she left me here when I was really little. I don't think he even knows about me." He spoke matter-of-factly, as if rehearsed. Before Vincent could respond, Samuel leaned his head against Vincent's shoulder. "You kinda remind me of him," Samuel said quietly. The words struck Vincent like a thunderclap. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Samuel smiled, his eyes already drooping with sleep. "You feel like a dad," he murmured, slipping into slumber. Vincent froze, his heart pounding. He had come here searching for someone to inherit his fortune, but in that moment, he realized he had found something far more precious, a connection he hadn't known he was missing. The next morning, Vincent found himself unable to shake the words Samuel had spoken the night before. "You feel like a dad." The sentiment, innocent as it was, had rooted itself deep in Vincent's heart. It brought a warmth he hadn't felt in years, but also a storm of questions he couldn't ignore. He approached one of the caregivers, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a sharp memory. "That boy over there," Vincent began, nodding towards Samuel, who was playing in the corner with a group of younger children. "Do you know much about his family?" The woman sighed, her expression softening. "Samuel's story is complicated. His mother brought him here when he was just a toddler. She was young, barely able to care for herself, let alone a child. She left a note, though, saying Samuel's father was an important man, but didn't leave a name or any contact information." Vincent's breath caught. "Important man," he repeated, the words ricocheting through his mind. Could it be possible? He thought back to the handful of fleeting relationships in his younger years, before his sterility had been discovered. There had been one woman, in particular, a brief but passionate affair that had ended abruptly. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the thought, but it was no use. The timing, the description, it was just enough to ignite a fragile ember of hope. Could Samuel be his son? Or was he clinging to a fantasy born of desperation? For the rest of the day, Vincent's attention wavered. He watched Samuel closely, searching for traces of himself in the boy's features or mannerisms. The idea terrified him as much as it thrilled him. If Samuel was his child, it would change everything. But if he wasn't, could Vincent still bear to walk away? The ache in Vincent's chest had become an unwelcome but familiar presence, a quiet alarm he could no longer ignore. He coughed into his sleeve, his breath ragged as he leaned against the cold stone wall of the orphanage yard. The chill in the air seemed to seep deeper into his bones these days, a grim reminder of the clock ticking down on his life. "Are you okay?" a small voice asked. Vincent looked up to see Samuel standing there, his brows knit with concern. "I'm fine," Vincent said quickly, managing a weak smile. But Samuel didn't look convinced. The boy hovered for a moment before reaching out to steady him as he shifted to stand upright. Later that evening, chaos erupted in the orphanage. One of the younger boys collapsed in the middle of the common room, his small body trembling with fever. Caregivers rushed to his side, their faces tight with fear. Samuel was among them, holding the boy's hand and whispering words of comfort. Vincent watched the scene unfold, his heart heavy with helplessness. He caught snippets of the frantic conversation between the staff. The boy needed immediate medical attention, but the orphanage's resources were stretched thin. The sight of Samuel, his face pale but determined, sparked something in Vincent. He couldn't stand by and do nothing. But what could he do without revealing his true identity? That night, Vincent lay awake, his mind racing. His own health was failing, and now the children's fragile lives seemed to hang in the balance as well. The burden of time pressed harder against him. He needed answers, not just about Samuel, but about how to help these children before it was too late. And for the first time, Vincent considered the possibility of abandoning his disguise to act. Vincent sat in the dimly lit office of the orphanage's director, his thoughts swirling like the storm clouds gathering outside. The faint murmurs of children in the hallway reached him, a reminder of why he was here. His disguise had allowed him to observe this world unfiltered, but now it felt like a prison. The young boy who had collapsed earlier was stable for now, but the orphanage lacked the funds for proper treatment. Vincent had overheard the staff talking about a hospital bill that seemed insurmountable. Every instinct screamed at him to step in, to write a check that would solve the problem in an instant. But doing so would blow his cover. What would happen then? Would the children and staff see him differently, treat him like an outsider who didn't belong? Worse still, would Samuel's growing bond with him dissolve the moment the truth came out? Vincent rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of the decision. If Samuel really was his son, none of it would matter. He could reveal himself, adopt the boy, and provide for the orphanage, without hesitation. But the uncertainty gnawed at him. Was he clinging to a coincidence, or was there something more? The next morning, under the guise of a friendly chat, Vincent approached the orphanage director. "I was wondering," he began carefully, "if the boy Samuel has any medical records. Something from his past that might help him in the future?" The director raised an eyebrow but nodded. "We keep what we can. Let me look." Later that day, Vincent left the orphanage briefly to visit a private clinic. In his pocket was a strand of Samuel's hair, taken from the boy's pillow. The DNA test would take time, but Vincent knew it was a step he had to take, even as his health grew weaker by the day. Time, it seemed, was running out for all of them. The results arrived sooner than Vincent expected. The envelope felt heavy in his trembling hands as he sat alone in a small cafe, far from the orphanage. The sterile clinic logo in the corner seemed to mock him, its cold professionalism a sharp contrast to the turbulent emotions inside him. He hesitated before tearing it open, his breath shallow and uneven. Inside was a single page. He read the words slowly, deliberately, as if hoping that stalling would somehow change their meaning. No biological relationship detected. Vincent leaned back in his chair, the noise of the cafe fading into a dull hum. He should have expected this. The odds had always been slim. Yet, the hope he hadn't even realized he'd nurtured shattered like glass. For a long moment, he stared out the window at the bustling street, his mind racing. This should have been the end of his mission, a confirmation that Samuel wasn't his son, a reason to step away and continue his search. But even as the disappointment settled, another realization began to take its place. The bond he felt with Samuel had nothing to do with DNA. He thought of the boy's quiet resilience, his innate kindness, and the way he had called Vincent father with such innocent sincerity. Samuel had shown Vincent something he hadn't experienced in years: unconditional trust and love. Tears welled in his eyes, surprising him. He had spent his life believing that legacy was tied to blood, that inheritance had to flow along family lines. But Samuel had proven him wrong. Family wasn't about biology, it was about choice, about love, about being there for someone who needed you. Vincent wiped his eyes and stood, his resolve hardening. He couldn't waste any more time. Samuel needed him now, and so did the other children. It was time to take action. The air in the orphanage's main office was thick with tension as Vincent stood before the director and two senior caregivers. His heart pounded, but his resolve never wavered. Gone were the tattered coat and dirt-streaked face. He had donned a simple, tailored suit, a symbol of the man he truly was. "I owe you all an explanation," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "My name is Vincent Morrow. I'm not a beggar. I'm a businessman, a very wealthy one. And I came here under false pretenses." The director's eyes widened, her hands clasping the desk in disbelief. "Why?" she asked softly. Vincent hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I wanted to find someone to carry on my legacy, someone who deserved it. I didn't expect to find this place, or these children. But after spending time here, I realized it's not about finding one person. It's about all of them. The caregivers exchanged stunned glances as Vincent continued. There's a boy here, Samuel, who made me see the world differently. And there are so many like him, full of potential but lacking the resources to thrive. I can change that. He slid a check across the desk. The director gasped as her eyes scanned the figure. This is enough to cover our debts, upgrade our facilities, and provide for every child here for years, she whispered. It's just the beginning, Vincent said firmly. I intend to leave my entire fortune to this orphanage. But more than that, I want to ensure Samuel and the others are equipped to manage it, to make decisions that will secure their future. As the reality of his words sank in, the caregivers' stunned expressions gave way to gratitude. Vincent, for the first time, felt the weight of his decision lift, replaced by something far greater: purpose. The children gathered in the common room, their curiosity palpable as Vincent stood at the front. Gone was the beggar they had known, replaced by a man whose presence commanded attention. Samuel stood among them, his wide eyes fixed on Vincent with a mix of confusion and awe. Children, Vincent began, his voice warm yet firm, you've welcomed me into your lives without judgment, without knowing who I really was. For that, I owe you my deepest gratitude. He paused, searching the sea of young faces before his gaze settled on Samuel. There's one among you who has taught me something invaluable, what it means to truly give, even when you have so little. Samuel, can you come here? Samuel stepped forward hesitantly, his small hands fidgeting. He stopped beside Vincent, glancing up at him with a mixture of trust and uncertainty. I want all of you to know, Vincent continued, addressing the room, that I'm leaving my wealth and resources to this orphanage to ensure every one of you has the chance to succeed. But I've also chosen someone to help guide this legacy when he's ready. He knelt before Samuel, meeting the boy's wide, teary eyes. Samuel, I'm naming you as the person responsible for managing this inheritance. Not alone, of course, you'll have help and support. But I trust you to grow into this role, to make decisions that honor the values you've already shown me. Samuel's lips trembled as he whispered, Me? But I'm just a kid. Vincent smiled, his voice steady. Yes, you're a child now. But one day, you'll be a man, and I have no doubt you'll be the kind of man this world needs. Tears spilled down Samuel's cheeks as he threw his arms around Vincent. Thank you, Father, he choked out, the word carrying a weight that neither would ever forget. The days that followed were unlike anything the orphanage had ever experienced. Supplies arrived in abundance: fresh food, warm blankets, new clothes. Repairs began on the crumbling walls, and the courtyard was cleared of weeds, making way for a playground. The children watched in awe as their world, once defined by scarcity, began to flourish. Vincent walked through the halls, his footsteps echoing in the renewed vibrancy of the space. Everywhere he turned, he was greeted with smiles. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The children, once cautious and guarded, now laughed freely, their eyes bright with hope. He found himself in the library one afternoon, watching as Samuel sat surrounded by a small group of younger children. The boy was reading aloud from the same battered book he had shown Vincent on that fateful night. His voice carried warmth and confidence, a far cry from the hesitant tones he once used. Vincent leaned against the doorway, a faint smile playing on his lips. He had spent his life believing that his wealth was his greatest achievement, but now he saw the truth. His legacy wasn't in the money he had earned, but in the lives he was changing. Later, sitting in the garden with the orphanage director, Vincent reflected on his journey. It's strange, he said quietly. I spent years building walls around myself, thinking they'd protect me. But they only kept me from living. The director nodded, her expression thoughtful. You've given these children more than just a chance, Mr. Morrow. You've shown them that they matter, that someone believes in them. That's something no amount of money can buy. Vincent exhaled, feeling a deep sense of peace. For the first time in decades, he felt whole, not as a millionaire, but as a man who had finally found his purpose. It was a sunny afternoon when Vincent sat in the courtyard, surrounded by the sounds of children's laughter. Samuel was beside him, fiddling with a puzzle that one of the newly arrived donors had brought. The boy had been quieter than usual, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Something on your mind, Samuel?" Vincent asked, tilting his head. Samuel looked up, his eyes thoughtful. "Do you think I'll be good at taking care of all this?" He gestured vaguely toward the orphanage buildings, his small hands indicating the enormity of the responsibility he'd been entrusted with. Vincent chuckled softly. "I think you'll be better at it than I ever was," he said honestly. "You already know what it means to care for others. The rest is just learning as you go." Samuel smiled at that, his expression easing. Then, in an unexpected gesture, he reached over and took Vincent's hand. "I think you're the best dad I could have ever had," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. Vincent froze, the boy's words filling the air like music. He squeezed Samuel's hand gently. "And you're the son I never knew I needed," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. As the days passed, the sense of family within the orphanage grew stronger. The caregivers began calling Vincent by his first name, their formality melting into gratitude and respect. The children flocked to him for advice, stories, or simply to sit beside him during meals. He became a fixture of their lives, not just as a benefactor, but as a trusted presence. One evening, the director gathered the children and staff for a small celebration in Vincent's honor. "To Mr. Morrow," she said, raising a toast, "the man who turned a house of survival into a home of hope." The cheers that followed filled Vincent's heart in a way no boardroom applause ever had. The sky was painted in hues of amber and violet as Vincent and Samuel sat together on a bench in the newly restored garden. The air carried the soft hum of crickets and the occasional burst of laughter from the other children playing nearby. It was a moment of quiet amidst the joyful chaos, and Vincent cherished it. "Do you ever think about your parents?" Vincent asked gently, breaking the silence. Samuel nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes. I wonder what they were like. Mama was always kind, but she was sad a lot. And my dad," he paused, then shrugged. "I don't know. I guess I used to dream about him coming back one day." Vincent felt a lump rise in his throat. "And now?" he asked, his voice soft. Samuel turned to him, a small smile playing on his lips. "Now I don't have to dream anymore. You're here." The words settled over Vincent like a warm blanket, filling the cracks in his heart that he'd thought would never mend. "You've given me more than I could ever give you, Samuel," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me a reason to keep going, even when I thought I couldn't." Samuel leaned into him, resting his head against Vincent's shoulder. "I think that's what dads are supposed to do," he said simply. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Vincent closed his eyes and let the moment envelop him. His illness was still there, a shadow he couldn't escape, but it no longer felt like a burden. He had found peace, not in wealth or power, but in love, in connection, in the family he had built. "I'm proud of you, son," he whispered, and in those words was the culmination of everything he had longed to say. The lawyer's pen scratched against the paper, the sound crisp in the quiet office. Vincent sat across the desk, watching intently as the final documents were signed, each stroke solidifying his intentions. His estate, his businesses, and the vast fortune he had amassed over a lifetime were now entrusted to the St. Althea Orphanage and, eventually, to Samuel. The orphanage director stood nearby, her hands trembling as she held the stack of papers. This changes everything," she said, her voice filled with awe. "It's what I was meant to do," Vincent replied simply. His tone was calm, steady, a reflection of the peace he now felt. In the days that followed, the transformation of the orphanage became even more pronounced. A board of trustees was formed, composed of trusted individuals who would oversee the funds and ensure the orphanage's long-term success. Vincent personally selected them, each one committed to the values he held dear. For Samuel, Vincent had laid out a special plan. While the boy was still too young to take on leadership, Vincent arranged for him to receive mentorship, education, and training to prepare him for his role. "You're going to be a great leader someday," Vincent told him. "But for now, your only job is to grow, learn, and keep being the kind, strong person you already are." As Vincent watched the pieces fall into place, a profound sense of satisfaction settled over him. His wealth, once a source of emptiness and isolation, had become a tool of change and hope. The children thrived, their futures brighter than ever, and Vincent knew he had done everything he could to secure their happiness. For the first time in years, he felt free. The children's laughter echoed across the courtyard as Vincent sat in the shade of a large oak tree, watching their carefree games. It had become his favorite part of the day, these simple moments when joy radiated from every corner of the orphanage. The vibrant energy reminded him of how far they had come, and how far he had come, too. His thoughts wandered back to the man he used to be, cold, isolated, and defined by his wealth. In those days, he had equated success with the size of his bank account and the grandeur of his estate. Now, sitting among children who had once only known struggle, he understood that success was about something far greater: love, kindness, and the lives you touched. Samuel appeared suddenly, carrying a carefully wrapped package. "We made something for you," the boy said, his grin wide. Behind him, the other children gathered, their faces alight with excitement. Vincent opened the package to find a large, hand-painted portrait. It was a simple but heartfelt depiction of him sitting with the children, surrounded by the orphanage he had transformed. At the bottom were the words, "Thank you for being our family." Tears filled Vincent's eyes as he traced the brushstrokes with trembling fingers. "It's beautiful," he whispered. "Thank you." The director stepped forward, her expression filled with gratitude. "You've given us more than we could ever repay, Vincent," she said. "Not just the resources to survive, but the hope and love we needed to thrive." As the children crowded around him, clamoring for his attention, Vincent laughed, a deep, genuine sound that felt as natural as breathing. In their faces, he saw not just gratitude but belonging. For the first time, he felt he was part of something eternal, something that would live on long after he was gone. The orphanage was alive with the sounds of a new beginning. The freshly painted walls gleamed in the sunlight, the once overgrown garden now a vibrant expanse of flowers and laughter. Vincent strolled through the grounds, savoring the sights and sounds of the place that had become his sanctuary. Samuel walked beside him, holding his hand tightly. "I've been thinking," the boy said, his voice bright with excitement. "Someday, I want to open more places like this. For kids who don't have homes or families. Like what you've done here." Vincent's chest swelled with pride. "You can do anything you set your mind to, Samuel. And when that day comes, I'll be the proudest man in the world, even if I'm not here to see it." Samuel stopped and looked up at him, his young face serious. "But you'll always be here," he said, placing a hand over his heart. "That's what family is." The simplicity of the boy's words brought a lump to Vincent's throat. He knelt to Samuel's level, placing both hands on his small shoulders. "You've already made me the happiest man I could ever be," he said softly. "And I know you're going to make the world a better place." That evening, Vincent gathered the children and staff for one final announcement. "I've spent my life chasing things I thought mattered," he said, his voice steady. "But it's here, with all of you, that I've finally found what truly matters. You are my family, and this is my home." As the children embraced him, their love surrounding him like a warm tide, Vincent felt an overwhelming peace. The shadows of his past and the fears of his mortality faded into the background. He had found not just an heir, but a family, and in them, a legacy that would endure for generations.